Hello, I'm doing a movie review, and the movie I want to review is Universal's 1931 version of Dracula. Now, the film is of course based on the 1897 novel of the same name by Bram Stoker. Now, I have the movie on this box set here called Dracula, the Legacy Collection. Now, the film is directed by Tod Browning, who a year after this directed the movie Freaks. Now, this is technically the third adaptation of Stoker's novel. 10 years prior to this, in 1921, there was a Hungarian film entitled Dracula's Death. Now, unfortunately, Dracula's Death is now considered to be a lost film, like no known copies of the movie exist. But from everything I've heard of Dracula's Death, that was apparently just a in-name-only adaptation. Like, the only thing that movie owes to the book is the name. To the best of my knowledge, that movie has no story elements in common with the original novel. I'm actually not even sure if Dracula was supposed to be a vampire in that movie, but that was technically the first film adaptation of Stoker's novel, even if it was an in-name-only adaptation. But a year later, you had the German expressionist film NOSFERATU, which is considered by many to be the first real adaptation of Dracula because this movie was actually based on the story from the book. Now, this was an unauthorized adaptation because F.W. Murnau, the director of NOSFERATU, could not secure the rights to the novel from Bram Stoker's widow. Bram Stoker had been dead for 10 years at that point. So, to avoid legal action from Stoker's widow, F.W. Murnau changed the name of the vampire from Count Dracula to Count Orlok, and he also changed the names of the other characters from the book as well. Now, even though he changed the names of the characters, this was not fooling Bram Stoker's widow, and she managed to convince the German courts that the film was copyright infringement on her late husband's novel. And she actually tried to have all copies of the movie destroyed, but fortunately she failed in that mission, and it's a good thing she did because NOSFERATU could have become a lost film as well, and if it wasn't for NOSFERATU, we might not have had this movie, because this movie, even though it was the first authorized adaptation of the novel, this movie actually does, strangely enough, I think, owe a little bit to NOSFERATU. And it's actually kind of funny that Bram Stoker's widow made such a big deal over NOSFERATU, yet she said nothing about Dracula's Death. I'm guessing Dracula's Death probably fell under her radar. Now, as I said, this movie, the 1931 version, is technically the third adaptation of Bram Stoker's Dracula, but the first adaptation was an in-name-only adaptation, and the second adaptation was an unauthorized adaptation. Well, technically, I think they were both unauthorized, but this was the first authorized adaptation because Universal Pictures, the company that distributed and produced this movie, they actually managed to legally get the rights to the novel from Bram Stoker's widow. Now, anybody who's read the book and seen this movie would realize that this movie has little to nothing to do with the book. It only takes the same basic idea of the book and pretty much does its own thing with it. Now, originally this was going to be a much more faithful adaptation of the novel, and this was supposed to be this huge, lavish production, but because this was right at the beginning of the Great Depression, for budgetary reasons, they really couldn't spend that much money on the movie, so they had to scale it all down, and because of that, they really couldn't do a more faithful adaptation of the book, because if you've actually read that book, you would realize that to do a faithful adaptation of that, especially around this time, would have required a really big budget. And also, even though this was a pre-code movie, I'm not sure if they would have been able to to get away with all the sexual themes of the novel and all the violence in the novel as well. Now, almost a year ago, I actually did do an almost hour-long review of the book, so if you want to know more of my thoughts on Bram Stoker's novel, just check out that review. But later on in this review, I will address some of the major differences between this movie and the book. Now, the movie is actually based on a play adaptation of Bram Stoker's novel, which was written by Hamilton Deane and John L. Balderston. Now, the plot of the 1931 version of Dracula is it begins where this real estate agent named Renfield travels to Transylvania to meet this count named Dracula who wishes to buy property in London. And when he gets to Dracula's castle, he discovers to his horror that Dracula is actually a vampire. And after an encounter with 3 of Dracula's vampire brides, Renfield goes insane, and he ends up becoming Dracula's familiar. And with the help of the now insane Renfield, Dracula travels to London, and he starts preying on young women, particularly this young woman named Mina, who is about to be married to this man named Jonathan Harker. And eventually, Jonathan Harker and Mina's father discover that this man, Dracula, who has been entering their lives, is in fact a vampire, and with the help of a scientist who believes in the supernatural named Dr. Abraham Van Helsing, they now have to protect Mina from Dracula. Now, I don't think there's any denying that this film is a classic. Now, I'll admit this is not one of my favorites of the Universal horror films, but this is still such an important film, and even if you don't like this movie at all, you still have to respect this movie because of the influence that this film had on the horror genre. Now, Dracula came out at a time when talking pictures, or talkies, were a new thing, and this was actually the first talking supernatural horror film. And Tod Browning, who came from the silent era of filmmaking, was not used to making a talking picture. Now, even though Tod Browning is credited as the director of this movie, rumor has it that his presence really wasn't felt on set, and rumor has it that Carl Frye, the cinematographer for this movie, actually directed much of this film. And Carl Frye's cinematography is just fantastic in the movie. Like, there are some shots in this movie which are really freaking spooky, even by today's standards. Like, in one of the first scenes that takes place at Dracula's castle, you get this shot of bugs and armadillos coming out of coffins, and it's really weird and really surreal looking, and even the first shot of Dracula is, once again, pretty freaking spooky looking. And it actually owes a lot to the German Expressionist films, and Carl Frye, who came from Germany, actually did camera work on many German Expressionist movies, including Metropolis, and including a film called The Last Laugh, which was directed by F.W. Murnau, who coincidentally also directed NOSFERATU, which this film is technically a remake of. Now, in the film, Dracula is of course played by Bela Lugosi, and Bela Lugosi's portrayal of Dracula is definitely the most iconic Dracula. Now, if you actually read the book by Bram Stoker, the Dracula in this movie that Bela Lugosi plays really looks nothing like he did in the book, and this is really where the whole idea of Dracula being sort of seductive and Dracula being charming came from, because, once again, in the novel, Dracula was actually really kind of repulsive in the book. And believe it or not, Bela Lugosi was actually kind of a sex symbol at the time, which is definitely a testament to how much standards have changed since 1931. Now, Bela Lugosi, prior to this, actually did play Dracula in many different stage adaptations of Dracula, but he was actually not Universal's first choice for this movie, and he actually had to kind of fight for this role. Universal's first choice for Dracula was actually Lon Chaney's Sr., but unfortunately Lon Chaney Sr. died of throat cancer shortly before the production of this movie. But honestly though, even though so many other actors have played Dracula, for this particular Dracula movie, it's hard to imagine anybody else besides Bela Lugosi in this role. And honestly, I think every other actor who has played Dracula after this has probably taken something from Bela Lugosi's performance. And it was really Bela Lugosi's Dracula where the whole idea of Dracula being in a long black cape came from, because once again, that's not really how he was described in the book, and a lot of our modern day images of Dracula really came from this movie. Now, Bela Lugosi would later say that playing Dracula was both a blessing and a curse, because the role of Dracula has really followed him throughout the rest of his career, even though he's only played Dracula on film one other time. Now, in the movie, Edward Van Sloan played Dr. Abraham Van Helsing, and he is good in the movie, but I will say that by today's standards, his performance is a little hokey. Well, you could argue that a lot of the performances in the movie are kind of hokey by today's standards, because back in 1931, acting styles were completely different than acting styles today. But honestly, he's not one of my favorite people to have played Van Helsing, but it's not really fair to say that because he obviously played Van Helsing before so many other people played him. Now, the character of Van Helsing technically did appear in NOSFERATU, however, he went under a different name in that movie. So, unless you count the version of Van Helsing that appeared in NOSFERATU, he was kind of the first person to play Van Helsing on screen. But he's not really my personal favorite Van Helsing. Personally, my favorite Van Helsings would either have to be Peter Cushing's take on the character from the Hammer Dracula films, or Anthony Hopkins' portrayal of the character from Francis Ford Coppola's version of Dracula. But once again, he was one of the first people to play Van Helsing on screen, so I do kind of have to give him respect in that regard. And there is one scene between Dracula and Van Helsing in this movie that I think is really badass, and it's the scene where Dracula first realizes that Van Helsing is a force to be reckoned with, which I really liked because the relationship between Dracula and Van Helsing is one of the greatest hero-slash-villain relationships in movies and literature. And even though this movie and the book came out years before the Batman comics were written, I would honestly compare the relationship or the rivalry between Van Helsing and Dracula to the rivalry between Batman and the Joker. And that scene where Dracula first realizes that Van Helsing is a force to be reckoned with is a really badass scene because you realize that it's the birth of a rivalry. But to me, the actor who really steals this movie from the rest of the cast really is Dwight Frye as Renfield, because Renfield in this movie is creepy and insane. At the same time, though, he's really sympathetic as well. Because he starts out the movie as this normal guy who gets dragged into this horrible situation, and he's driven insane, and you feel so bad for him because he becomes a raving lunatic, but it's really not his fault. So I think Dwight Frye's performance is easily the most standout performance in the movie. Now, unfortunately, because Dwight Frye played Renfield in this movie, he kind of got typecast as playing raving lunatics in movies. Now, in the movie, David Matters plays Jonathan Harker, and he does do a really good job in this movie. However, the character of Harker is very underwritten in this film, and his role in the movie really doesn't amount to much, in my opinion. That being said, Matters still does a good job in the role, and what's funny is David Matters actually did not take this subject matter seriously at all. He actually thought it was kind of goofy, and he was actually perplexed at all the fan mail he got years later because of his role in this movie. In the movie, Helen Chandler plays Mina, and she's actually really charming in the role, and is actually quite funny in the role. Like, she does have a few funny moments, like, there's a scene in the movie earlier on after they first meet Dracula, and this is obviously before they find out that Dracula is a vampire, but her and Lucy are talking about Dracula, and she's actually making fun of Dracula's voice, which I thought was a really funny moment in the film. Unfortunately, besides that, Mina, like Harker, is kind of underwritten in the film, and her role in the film really doesn't amount to much more than being the damsel in distress. That being said, Helen Chandler is still really charming in the role, and I gotta say, Helen Chandler around this time was freaking gorgeous, and hers is actually a really sad story. She actually battled alcoholism, and her alcoholism pretty much led to the end of her career, and it also destroyed 2 of her marriages. And in 1950, she was actually severely burned in an apartment fire when she fell asleep with a lit cigarette in her hand. Now, I'm going to take a quick break from this review and play a few short reviews that some friends of mine did on this movie, so check out my friends' thoughts on this movie, and then when it comes back to my review, I'll be talking about the major differences between this movie and the book, and then talking about the influence that this movie had on pop culture.
Okay, so 1931's Dracula. Obviously, it's one of the most important horror films in the history of horror, right? It was the first universal horror film, right? The first talking one, at least. And of course, Bela Lugosi gives perhaps the most iconic performance in any horror film as Dracula. I mean, when people think of Dracula, they don't think of anybody else except Bela Lugosi. At least that's the first, idea. And even it's become a part of our cultural consciousness. Right, the widow's peak, the wearing the tuxedo, the Hungarian accents. It's really become a part of our cultural consciousness. It's a part of pop culture lexicon. And he's brilliant. Bela Lugosi's performance is great. I know a lot of people have sort of said he sort of over-exaggerates, he's hammy in it, but it fits. It fits because it's a story of sort of somebody who sort of overturns Victorian mores. So you're going to have you need somebody that's sort of over the top. You need somebody that is sort of theatrical to go against the sort of the stiff repressiveness of the Victorian times. So I think his performance is amazing. I think he's great. The other performance in the film, of course, Dwight Frye as Renfield. I feel that he almost steals the film from Bela, but luckily Bela's performance is so iconic that he's able to hold his own. But Dwight Frye's performance is great. Edward Van Sloan. I think his performance is more stilted as Van Helsing than Lugosi's. But they're all great. I mean, it's a great film. I know the film has a reputation of being sort of stagey and talky, that Browning just kind of sets his camera up, But, and I think to a certain extent that's true. But, I mean, if you look at the early sequences when you have, Renfield going to Transylvania. The camera moves great in that. There's that amazing scenes where the camera tracks into the coffin, right, and the hand coming out of the coffin, or the camera going up to meet Bela Lugosi on the staircase as he welcomes Renfield into the house. Those are amazing shots. I think, and just the imagery within those shots of death and of sexuality coming together, his brides, it's an amazing depiction of Thanatos, of that sort of the death instinct, behind sort of love. So I think those scenes are amazing, The ending is kind of anticlimactic, that you don't get to see sort of Dracula staked and, and it kind of the movie just kind of ends there. But again, or even the scene where Dracula stalks the woman selling flowers outside in London, that's a suspenseful scene as well. So again, I understand where people would say that the movie is kind of stagey and kind of talky and does remind you of a play. Yes, some scenes that, but I don't think it bears an overall sort of evaluation of the film as being that. I think there are scenes within that definitely do commit that crime, if you want to call it that. But the rest of the film, I think, really sort of, doesn't bear that out, that it is a more dynamic film than people give it credit for. Again, so I guess they're talking about Browning's directing. I think, there's been a lot of rumors that he lost interest in the film, that he was drunk, that he let his cinematographer do it. And again, I mean, if you look at other Browning films, it's very similar. I don't really think that this film is an anomaly in Browning's career. For whatever reason, he has this sort of reputation for being, this kind of a director that lost interest in projects or sort of didn't give his all to his films. But I don't think so. I mean, if you look at, I think Dracula is an amazing achievement. Freaks and, his films with Chaney, those films are amazing too. So, again, I don't know, but maybe because in comparison to maybe like James Whale's films, which are a little bit more intellectual, which are a little bit more, move a little bit more quickly than Browning's films, that he has this sort of bad rap. But the 1931 Dracula, I think, is amazing. I think it's an important film. It's one of the most, if not the most important film in horror cinema. And I think that Bela Lugosi deserves all the accolades possible for his performance, because he really put horror on the map and made horror a part of our culture by emoting this kind of character or embodying this character to audiences. Also think it's interesting that the film came out on Valentine's Day, right? The original 1931 came out on Valentine's Day, and a lot of people, young men, I guess, use the film as a way to sort of have young women, I guess, like grab them or like, or frighten them into physical contact, which I think is an interesting, if not kind of creepy, use of the film, but it was used that way. But again, I think the 1931 Dracula is a really amazing achievement.
Yeah, 1931's Dracula is a movie that I consider to be a horror masterpiece, just because it's a great story based off a fantastic horror novel, and it has a terrific actor in the lead role, Bela Lugosi, who he gives the role such, I believe, depth, and he brings a certain creepiness, but also he's very suave, and I think that really works for the character. And, the atmosphere is very, surreal and gloomy, and there's always a very creepy vibe around, and, in every shot. The shot of the brides when they're first introduced, it's like they're just appearing, they're very ghostly. It's things like that I think really make this film, powerful in its terror.
Yeah, I think Dracula is a great, horror film, despite, what people complain about how, oh, there's no music, it's a slow-paced film. You have to push that aside and realize sometimes the music is not always, the answer to, not in horror films, just films in general. When you look at the atmosphere and Bela Lugosi's performance, it's amazing and scary and chilling. And also, not only was Lugosi scary in the part, Dwight Frye played
Renfield.
Renfield, very scary. He also, stole the show in some ways, too.
So Dracula I love a lot. You can't really beat it. But I will say that out of all the Universal monster movies, I do think it is the one that's most flawed. My personal favorite is Wolfman, but I think that's, just like a personal thing. I don't know if I could really say it's better than this one. But I will say that, obviously, Bela, he was so good at it because he'd been playing Dracula, I think, on stage for a while at that point, and then played him on stage for a while afterwards. And just, it sets a tone so well, like all the Universal monster stuff does, because, that black and white color scheme, and just the fact that it's a different kind of horror from what we're used to today, where it's all jump scares. This is more just a slow kind of brooding creepiness that I'm sure really made an impact on people back in the day. What I will say, though, is ironically, they filmed the Spanish version at the same time as this one. When they cut at the end of the night, this Spanish crew would come in, totally new actors, totally new crew, obviously all them Spanish speakers, and they would film a whole other movie with the same sets. And I think they might have been spying the dailies and shit, because you can tell they were trying to do cooler stuff and trying to come up with creepier vibes and cooler shots and that kind of thing. So if you haven't heard of that, or if you haven't seen that, definitely check that out. It's a cool, almost companion piece to this one, because the guy that plays Dracula in that one, he comes off as more maniac, as opposed to Bela's kind of suaveness. It's a cool kind of experiment in how differently you can make a movie. So I do enjoy this one, but it has its issues. So take it or leave it, basically.
Picture this. I'm 4 years old. It's Halloween. My father is sitting in front of the TV eating popcorn and calling me over to watch a movie with him. When I ask him which movie it is, he tells me a good one. The same answer he always gave me when I asked him that question. And I sat down and together we watched the very first Universal horror film I had ever seen, Dracula. Now, right off the bat, I will say that Dracula is not my favorite of the Universal horror films. That title belt is still held by The Phantom of the Opera, the old silent one. But this is one of the greatest films ever created nevertheless. Starring Bela Lugosi as the titular character, the story takes place in Transylvania, where a man named Renfield is traveling to visit the Count in order to discuss business. I won't go farther than that with the plot because I'm sure Christian has already gone into it, but it was necessary for me to bring that up because that leads to one of the greatest scenes in cinema history. Renfield gets out of the carriage he was brought in, driven by a bat by the way, and is welcomed by our dear Count Dracula, who is standing midway up the staircase which leads to his castle. After a few words, we hear the sound of wolves howling in the night, and Dracula, who was already heading up the stairs, turns to Renfield and says, "Listen to them, the children of the night. What music they make. Awesome. Just fucking awesome. And creepy as hell, because the calmness, the darkness, the weird way that Dracula is looking at Renfield, like he wants to fuck Renfield, is just creepy. If Dracula existed today, I'm sure there would be 666 MeToo hashtags slapped on his ass. Creepy bastard. But anyway, there are plenty of other scenes that are just as good though. The awakening of Dracula's brides is kinky. Yeah, that works. Kinky. And the scene when Dracula goes into a window in bat form is about to get another hashtag thrown at his ass is just spellbinding. And my favorite scene of all, the most badass confrontation between hero and villain I've seen since Prince went up against Morris Day in the great and fantastic movie Purple Rain, is when Dr. Abraham Van Helsing, OG Triple OG, faces Dracula and Dracula tries to hypnotize him, and then Van Helsing pulls out a crucifix and Dracula shrieks, throws up his cape, spins around and flees the scene. Sexy. Just sexy. God, I love this movie. Just talking about it makes me want to watch it again, which I probably will right after I'm done here. The movie as a whole, though, is amazing, and if you haven't watched it, please, what are you doing? How can you have lived this long without watching Dracula? Pick it up, rent it, download it digitally, do whatever you have to do to watch this movie. Because it really is a true classic and must see for anyone, not just horror fans, but anyone who has a deep love of films like I do.
So, I hope you guys enjoyed my friend's takes on this movie. Now on to some of the major differences between this movie and the original novel by Bram Stoker. One of the major differences really is the characters. This movie leaves out a lot of characters from the book, but also changes a lot of characters as well. For example, the character of Renfield was much more violent in the book. Now granted, this was a 1931 movie, and even though this was a few years prior to the Hays Code, I'm still not sure they would have been able to get away with how violent the character of Renfield was from the book in a 1931 American film. But also in the book, you never actually find out how or why Renfield went crazy, and you never find out how he became Dracula's familiar, but in this movie they actually give you an origin for Renfield. And also, in the beginning of this movie, when you see Renfield as a normal person, as a real estate agent, going to Dracula's castle to meet with Count Dracula, he's actually playing the role of Jonathan Harker from the book. Because in the book, Jonathan Harker was actually a real estate agent, and he was the real estate agent who was going to see Dracula in the beginning of the novel. Also, the character of Jonathan Harker is quite different in this movie than he was in the novel, and I don't even think he's supposed to be a real estate agent in this movie. Also, in the book, there was a character named Dr. John Stewart, and that character is in this movie, however, he's completely different in this film. For example, in the movie, he's much older than the character was in the book, and he's also Mina's father in this movie, whereas in the book, there was no relation between him and Mina. The character of Lucy from the book is in this movie, however her role is much smaller than it was in the book. And also, the character of Mina is a little bit different in this movie than she was in the novel. And I think another major difference is in this movie, they really just sort of scaled the scope of the story from the novel down, because the novel took place over the course of several months, and this movie seems to take place over the course of only a few days. Also, this movie really takes place in only one location. It takes place at this mental hospital where Mina and Dr. Stewart live, and Renfield is being held at, and that's the primary location of this movie, whereas the novel took place in several different locations. And also, in the novel, Dracula was much more of this mysterious figure that the main characters never really had that much interaction with, aside from trying to hunt him down. But in this movie, Dracula actually does interact with these people before they find out that he's a vampire. And also, the book really becomes almost like an action-adventure novel by the final act, where the main characters all form a team of vampire hunters to hunt down and destroy Dracula, and they actually travel all the way back to Transylvania to kill Dracula, but none of that is in this movie. And by the way, I'm not criticizing the movie for deviating so much from the novel. I understand why this movie really couldn't follow the novel, because once again, this was the time of the Great Depression, and they really didn't have like the biggest budget in the world, and in order to do an accurate adaptation of the novel, especially at this time, it would have required a huge budget. And I understand this movie is actually more so based on a stage adaptation of the novel, and obviously there's only so much you could do on stage. Now, right around the same time this movie came out, there was also a Spanish version of Dracula. Now, the Spanish version of Dracula actually used the same shooting script and was actually shot on the same sets, and it was actually shot simultaneously with the American version. Now, from what I heard, apparently the English version of this movie was shot during the day, and the Spanish version was shot at night, but they used the same sets. Now, many critics say that the Spanish version of Dracula is technically superior to the English version. Now, it's been a long time since I've seen the Spanish version, so I really can't say one way or the other. But this DVD set, Dracula The Legacy Collection, actually does come with the Spanish version. Now, this is an older edition of the Dracula Legacy Collection, and I know there was a newer edition, and I'm not sure if the newer edition has the Spanish language version or not, but this edition does. Now, this movie was a huge success when it came out, and it actually prompted Universal to do another adaptation of another classic horror novel, and that was their 1931 adaptation of Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. Now, both this movie and their adaptation of Frankenstein would go on to spawn a series of sequels. Now, this movie spawned a sequel in 1936 titled Dracula's Daughter, and then another sequel titled Son of Dracula. And as I said, their adaptation of Frankenstein also spawned its own series of sequels, and eventually the Frankenstein sequels and the Dracula sequels actually crossed over, and in 1944 you had the film House of Frankenstein, which was a crossover between Universal's Dracula series and Universal's Frankenstein series and the Wolfman series. And then you had House of Dracula, which, like House of Frankenstein, was a crossover between Universal's Frankenstein series and their Dracula series and the Wolfman series. And then the final film of Universal's Dracula series was the 1948 horror comedy film Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein, which was a crossover between the Dracula series, the Frankenstein series, and the Wolfman series. Now, Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein was also the only other time that Bela Lugosi actually played Dracula on film. Now, besides spawning a series of sequels, this film also had a tremendous influence on pop culture, which is still being felt today. Like, as I said earlier in this video, a lot of people's ideas and perceptions of Dracula really came from this movie. Like, the whole idea of Dracula wearing a long black cape, that came from this film. Once again, that's not how he was described in the book. And it was really Bela Lugosi's take on Dracula that influenced pop culture. Like, stuff like the Count from Sesame Street and Count Chocula was definitely inspired by Bela Lugosi's portrayal of Dracula. Now, of course, there have been so many other actors who have played Dracula over the years, but I would argue that most of those actors probably owe something to Bela Lugosi's portrayal of the character. Now, as iconic as Bela Lugosi is in the role, my personal favorite film Dracula is Christopher Lee, but even Christopher Lee probably owed a lot to Bela Lugosi. And even Bela Lugosi himself was never able to fully escape the Dracula role, and he actually played similar characters in movies like Mark of the Vampire and Return of the Vampire, but officially he only played the character twice on film. And after he died, he was actually buried in the Dracula cape. Now, even though Dracula was originally a novel, and even though this wasn't the first adaptation of that novel, nearly every other adaptation of Dracula since this owes something to this movie, I think. Even the Francis Ford Coppola version of Dracula, which is arguably the most faithful adaptation of the novel out of all of them, even that one owes something to this movie, because that movie actually does take some stuff directly from this film. For example, they actually do give you Renfield's origin in that movie, and his origin in that movie is similar to how it was in this movie. So yeah, that was my review on Universal's 1931 version of Dracula, and my next movie review will be Dracula's Daughter.